day to you. Thank you for joining us today. This is our Genesis series, and today we're going to be looking at some supplemental material for our beginning that we had in Genesis chapter 1. So if you haven't already, I'm going to encourage you to pause here, go back to our sermon from this past Sunday to look at what we were talking about a bit, and then continue on here. But if you're watching us now, that means you want to get a glimpse of what this supplemental material is supposed to look like. Again, we're going to do this every Wednesday, and we're going to post it on our YouTube page for you to use as you continue in your study and as we journey together as a church in the book of Genesis. So today we're just going to go a bit through Genesis 1 again, just to highlight some areas that I didn't get to touch base on during the sermon, and to maybe expand your own thinking and to even challenge some of the ways that you have looked at this book, looked at this opening chapter in history past. So the goal is just to give you some more information, some more insight into some areas that we didn't get to delve into. So one of the challenges that we have with the book of Genesis, in Genesis 1 especially, is the whole creation narrative and what we're supposed to do with that as Christians. And one of the real challenges that we have is, what do we do with science and what do we do with this creation account? So typically there have been some challenges to the opening chapter of the book of the Bible and the book of Genesis. One of the big challenges obviously today is the onset of the theory of evolution. And of course, if you know, Darwin and science are looking for an explanation on creation and evolution and how all this works. And the challenge is that the Bible tends to stand in opposition to some of the positions they have in their theories. However, the reality is that, again, evolution continues to be a theory. It's not provable by any stretch of the imagination either. But our point here is not to argue whether the Bible is right or whether evolution is right. Really, they don't stand in opposition to each other. They really just sort of stand, they're two very different things. They're two very different discussions. It's like arguing, I have a sweet apple, so why is your orange sour? Like, those are two different fruits. They're two very different things that we're trying to understand. And so part of it has been the challenge that many of us experience when it comes to creation and evolution and the discussion of silence. So I just want to keep that in the back of your head, that it's really not something that we have to be so worried about or have such a firm position on one way or the other. But the Bible's purpose is actually very different when we look at the Genesis account. It's not a scientific book. The second thing that we have, that some of the challenges we face with it, is what do we do about the other folk tales and the other creation myths and the creation stories of other cultures during the ancient Near Eastern times? And so we're going to look at that a little bit later on in this as we go through this video today. So that's something for us to consider and think about as well. The last is this. Some people, when they look at the scriptures, when they look very closely at Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, sometimes people have this idea that there are two different creation stories within that. And this comes from a criticism called literary criticism. And it's looking at the finer details of how the book is composed, the writing of it, how it was written. And so sometimes people see that there is this two-part creation story. Genesis 1 talks about one creation and Genesis 2 talks about a different creation. We're not going to get into that one today. Actually, we're going to save that one for next Wednesday when we actually get through Genesis 2, so that you have an idea of what we're going to talk about. So let's talk about some of the challenges we have here. Well, the view of creation with a scientific mindset. Now, here's the thing. We're trying to prove that the Bible sometimes is scientifically accurate. And again, at the end of the day, it's not a scientific textbook. It doesn't set out to prove a science theory in any way, shape, or form. And so again, evolution is a theory. Creation ideas are theories, and our Bible gives us just an account of the perspective that Moses had when he was given the inspiration of the scriptures from God. So some Christians argue about the idea of a young earth theory. They take the genealogies and they backtrack it and they say, oh, the earth can only be 5,000 years old. And then we struggle with geology, and we look at the science of geology and how rock formations and all these things give us an older earth, like 1 billion years old. Then we deal with issues of dinosaurs, and we deal with issues of how long humanity has existed. How long has the earth been around? And so again, we're struggling with this. And again, your Bible is not, and Genesis is not trying to argue from a scientific perspective. What it does give us, though, and in science, what it does give us as well in science, is that many scientists do look at the galaxy and the cosmos, the universe, and even the earth, and they can see within it there is a creative design. Now, whether or not they want to attribute that to our Creator God is another story. But again, many Christians, we get stuck in this debate, or we get stuck in this issue, and we're wondering, is it 7 literal days of creation, or is it 7 eras of time? And all that to say, again, this is not the purpose of how Genesis laid it out. So let's try to maybe come to grips with that and kind of put that aside. The second thing that we try to do then is we try to use the creation account as some kind of an apologetic, a defense on the existence of God. And again, this is actually not the point of the Genesis account here. The point is not to try to prove whether or not God exists. And so it's not about whether or not there are 7 literal days or not, and what was God doing, and how did God do this, and what methodology did God use to create things. No, the actual narrative of your Bible actually is not trying to prove whether God exists. The Bible actually says, we believe God exists already. And it's written to people who have some kind of belief that God already exists. So a lot of times we try to use the Bible to prove the existence of God, when in fact the Bible has already taken its position saying, we already believe in the existence of God. And so don't use the Bible to try to prove something that the Bible already believes in. It's actually a folly for us. So what tends to happen then is that we read into the text, and we read into things that aren't necessarily there. Another thing that we try to do during this creation account is we try to figure out mysteries which may or may not be explained elsewhere in the Bible. So what do we do with the fall of Satan? How do we know the story behind how Satan fell? What do we do with what we see as dinosaurs today? What about the creation of angels? What about heaven and hell? Where do they fit in to the creation narrative? And again, all those things are not told to us necessarily in this opening passage. And so sometimes we do have to deal with the mysteries of God, and the fact that the Bible doesn't give us every single answer to those questions. So we're looking into things and we're trying to find ways to fit certain theories or understandings in. And how do you have light without the sun, right? In our scientific mindset, we understand light with the sun in our galaxy. But the whole point, one of the biggest things about the idea of this Bible is to point out, we all worship something. At the end of the day, we do worship something. And the many things that we worship are simply that which has already been created. And the point of the Bible is not to determine how things were created or what was created. It's that we would worship the one who is the creator, the one who created everything. So again, we try to find these things, but they're not necessarily the goal or the importance of what the scriptures were trying to tell us. Another thing that we try to do is that we try to study, we don't study the passage that we have necessarily in its historical context. We have to remember that the Bible comes to a particular group of people in a particular time, and it has to make sense to them. This is what's called interpretation, and we use the term exegesis. We allow it to speak into the time and place that it was in, and then we draw from that time and place, the timeless truths. What we tend to do sometimes is we call it eisegesis. We read our situation into the Bible and try to prove our own positions or prove our own thoughts. So we need to study the Bible in its historical context. We need to study Genesis 1 in its historical context. And part of that is that this is God's grand narrative of his rescue plan. And it starts off in Genesis. It starts off in the beginning. Don't forget that Genesis is also part of a 5-volume book series called the Pentateuch: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. You can't pull Genesis out of those 5. They were written as a 5-part volume. And of course, it's part of the Old Testament. You can't read Genesis outside of the Old Testament. And it's the beginning of the Bible. You can't read it outside of the Bible context. Don't forget, Moses is writing to the people of Israel. He's writing their history and from their Exodus journey. And so God is establishing at this point Israel to be a nation, and he's telling them who he is, because Israel doesn't know. And even Moses, when he encountered God, he didn't know who he was. And so in Exodus 3:14, he says, God, who are you? And God responds, I am who I am. And so Genesis 1 through 11 is actually this introduction to the nation of Israel as they're becoming a nation, about a God who delivered them from Egypt. And the God who delivered them from Egypt is the same God who created the world, is the same God who made promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, their forefathers. And it's the idea that as they have this covenant with God at Mount Sinai, the same God who made promises to them at Mount Sinai is the same God who made promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So he's the same God who also created the world. And so again, this is the historical context that we have to always envision as the backdrop to the book of Genesis. And the last thing that we tend to do or not do is we rarely apply the passage of Genesis in relevant ways to our spiritual journey. We often, again, we're too busy debating whether or not creation or evolution, science, and all these things that are not in the intent of the author and not into the intent of the book. And so sometimes we just leave creation, we just leave it hanging, and we say it's nothing to do with our faith journey. But there are things that we're supposed to take away. You know, we could take away the idea, the bigness of God. We can take away the ideas of morality. We take away from it that we are made in the image of God, and God is creative, and we should have an appreciation for a God who's creative. That God is a covenant God. He's a promise-making and a promise-keeping God. He is also the creator. And here's the thing. It's part of this grand story that the God who is the creator has a purpose, and his purpose is to restore the world to where he wanted it to be. And he was going to use a nation called Israel as an heir to a promise to restore the world. But Israel fails to live up to God's promise. And here's how it translates to us today is that you and I are now participating in that same promise, and we fail all the time. And yet what we're supposed to take from this is that God doesn't fail. God's promises are sure. And they remain even despite our own failure and despite the failures of the nation of Israel before us. And so that's how it translates to us today. So this is what we need to know, is that we need to know that God is good and he provides what is good. So those are some of the challenges that we have with this creation narrative. I do want to also provide for you some backdrop for us to think about, some historical things and context for us to grasp. See, at the time of the writing of this book, we have this creation account, and we have this trying to understand how the universe came to be. And a lot of the nations that were around Israel at that time had their own creation narratives. They had their own creation stories. And here's the thing, we have that God is going to do things. God is establishing his purpose, and that he is the creator. He's trying to inform and tell the nation of Israel and to tell us that he is the one who is the creator. I want to read two passages for you. Our first passage is this. It's found in Jeremiah chapter 10, verse 11. Tell them this, these gods who did not make the heavens and the earth will perish from the earth and from under the heavens. Did you hear that? Tell them this, these gods who did not make the heavens and the earth will perish from the earth and from under the heavens. Because God, again, he's introducing himself. I am the one who created everything. All those gods that you worship or you think that are gods, they're really nothing compared to me. Psalm 96, verse 5. For all the gods of the nations are idols, but the Lord made the heavens. So at the time of writing, you have all these cultures and nations that have their own creation accounts and their own understanding of the universe. And God's purpose in this is to establish that he is the creator. They all have their gods, but I stand outside of that. So the creation narrative is God here preparing the land for humanity. And I want to just share with you that the idea of land is a very important thing. Again, when you take the grander story of the Pentateuch, the idea of the land is important because that was part of God's promise to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob. And so we need to see that with a little bit of a lens that says, hey, land is important, blessing is important, promises are important. And so this is the promised land, a fulfillment of a promise that continues. Even this land actually continues to be contested even to today, which is something historical to the truth of today, which is interesting. So again, what we have is that people are worried, are there similar creation accounts from other cultures, from other pagan societies? And let me just say, some of the similarities are this. There is a creation narrative out there from other cultures, whether it's Babylon, Egypt, Sumerians. Even today, when you talk to people of the indigenous background in Canada, there is always a creation narrative. A lot of times these creation narratives have waters out there. There's this water, a basis of water. There are gods that do things, and then there are first people. But in terms of the actual narratives itself, the Christian account in Genesis is actually very different from all the other accounts. It actually stands aside as very unique. So while they have the ideas of water and gods and people, how it all works and how it all plays out is very different. And let me just give you some. When you compare the difference of the Genesis creation account to the many stories out there, so one person, her name is Wakeman, she did a study on 12 different myths out there. And there were three common features in a lot of these myths. One was there's some kind of a repressive monster that was restraining creation, that was like stopping creation from happening. And then there would come this heroic God who would defeat the monster. And as a result of defeating the monster, they would unleash the ability to create life, and life would then form. And then there would be a continuous battle between this hero and this repressive monster about who controls the forces of the world. And a lot of the creation narratives have this type of thing, but our one in Genesis is so set aside and so different. Babylon has this idea of two gods, a saltwater god and a freshwater god. I'm going to paraphrase it a bit, and you can read them more in detail as you look at them up. And these two gods created other gods, and then there was a fight and a battle between all the gods, and then this champion arose. His name is Marduk, and he would become the champion. He would then create the heavens and the earth, and then he would point different gods to different duties and create people. Again, that sounds very different from our creation account. In Egypt, what you have is water chaos. And then you have the god of magic waiting, and then a pyramid shape rose out of the waters, and this mound appeared and was a pyramid shape. And the god Atum, who was lonely, and therefore he mated with his own shadow, and he created children, the air, children of air and moisture. And those children left, and Atum was worried, and so he removes his eye to go search for them, and that's the idea of the sun coming up, and then the sun god Ra, and the idea of that. From this, his expression of joy that he could find his children, tears would come, and those tears created people. The Wendat people, the Huron people in Canada, I mean, you have a woman who falls from the sky into the waters, and the waters exist, and so do sea creatures. And she's looking for what to do, and a rescue plan, and a turtle comes and tells her to dive, and through that becomes the land, right? And so you have all these different creation narratives. Ours is so different because at the end of the day, our God, he is not created. He stands outside of creation. He's the one who created everything. All these creation myths, these gods were created from something. They come up from something, or that the world already existed and that from it, these gods came out and started organizing the world. No, it says in our Bible, in Genesis, that God created, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. A lot of times in these other creation narratives, you have the gods who struggle are in conflict, and they're fighting, and they're trying things, and they don't know, they make mistakes, there's trial and error. And again, our God did not do any of that. He did not have conflict. He didn't struggle with anything. He spoke and it came to be, and it was good, he said. And so God creates everything. And in fact, one of the key things is that God creates people in his image, which is very different from a lot of the other creation accounts. So what we have is a lot of times in these other narratives, you have people who believe in these nature gods, the god of the sun, the god of the moon, the god of the water, the god of the sea, the god of the rain, the god of the various forces of nature like wind, and the god of crops and agriculture. Again, all of that to say that all these different gods, they're simply created, and our God set himself apart as the creator, the one and only, the one that is different from everyone and has no equal, has no rival. And so that's the big takeaway that we should have when we look at the other creation accounts compared to the one that we have here in Genesis. I want to focus a couple things, again, just to simply state some interpretations that people have in Genesis 1, verse 1 to Genesis 1, verse 3. And these are various takes on how we understand the creation narrative. They're just really for your information. They're different perspectives, but again, and they have their pros and they have their cons. One of the first things is that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And I know we were just focused so much on that during the Sunday. And there was a Latin term there called ex nihilo, and this is the idea, out of nothing, God created. There was nothing. Now, can you try to get that, imagine that? Imagine absolute nothingness. And what would that look like and what would that be? And then out of absolute nothingness, God created. That does have, for some of you, maybe that semblance of the Big Bang, and you ask the question about science again, and oftentimes when people say, well, is the Big Bang an appropriate theory, and many people say, well, it could be, but what caused that bang, right? And again, people, well, that means there was a creator, someone who caused that bang. And this idea of ex nihilo, this Latin term, out of nothing, something, it stands in contrast to a lot of the other creation accounts, because the other creation accounts would simply say there was chaos, there was something, and then the gods simply ordered what those somethings were. Again, so our scriptures talk about absolute nothingness, and God created, and boom, everything God created. And so that stands in difference to a lot of other theories out there. Another theory out there that Christians wrestle with is the gap theory. And the gap theory is this. In Genesis 1, you have, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then in Genesis 2, and the earth was formless and void, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And so what people do with that is that they sit there and go, okay, well, if from Genesis 1 and Genesis verse 1, Genesis verse 2, there's this gap time in between the two. And so people wonder, well, where does Satan fall come into this? And so what they believe is that if there's this, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, verse 1, there's this gap of a period of time, and that's why it's called the gap theory, that in that time, Satan falls. It allows for the idea of science to have a billion-year-old earth, because this time frame there was nothing. And then God starts to form. So out of the chaos that was created, God begins to recreate things. Now, one of the problems with the gap theory is that it also includes this idea that somewhere in there, God created the heavens and the earth, and then the earth had its challenges, and actually God may have actually wiped it out with a flood, pre-Noah, and that's why there's waters everywhere. And then he recreates things. And so there was this idea that somehow God created, it was good, but then it falls apart, and then he starts again in verse 2. Now that gap theory, again, then in verses 2 following, you have the 6 days, and they often call that the 6 literal day, 24-hour day period, in which God recreates everything. Now, there's another theory called the initial chaos theory. The initial chaos theory is that verse 1 starts as an introduction. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then verse 2 describes the creation as it's unformed and unfilled. And then in verse 3, God begins to work chaos into order. And so God creates everything, and then everything is unformed and unfilled. And then in verse 3, God then begins the process. And again, this theory would then have the notions of, the fall is in there of Satan, then how all these things like angels and stuff come to be is kind of in that beginning. God created the heavens and the earth, everything. And then now we're going to start focusing in on him just establishing how everything would be formed and filled. The last one is the idea of what's called the pre-creation chaos theory. And again, this is how this idea is that God began to create, right? And so in verse 1, God began to create. And here's the thing with this theory is that it's actually not an ex nihilo theory. It's not that everything came from nothing. Is that stuff was already there. So you hear the difference. Stuff was already there. And now God still was before all that stuff, because the idea is that matter and all these things, substance, all these things are not the subject of creation. So we're not talking about science. We're talking about the creation narrative is just the beginning of the world and civilization. We're not talking about the cosmos. We're not talking about matter and atoms and ions and particles and all these different scientific things. The whole point of the narrative is to talk about the beginning of the world and the beginning of civilization. And so this is not a concern for people who have this theory as a God who created out of nothing. It's just that God was organizing the world as we understand it to be. And so that's how this theory kind of plays out in some Christian perspectives. Now, again, these are all theories. These are all different ways that we can interpret and read Genesis 1. I'm not going to sit here and dictate to you which one you have to believe. In fact, what it is that God gives you wisdom, God gives you discernment. But the hard part is sometimes with our own wisdom and discernment, we stand in these camps and we just say it has to be this way. It has to be this way. Much like sometimes with sciences, we say, it has to be this way, and if we're outside of that, you're not being a faithful Christian or you're not being a faithful scientist. No, we have this scripture. It's something that you and I don't get to see. It is something that God is speaking through Moses to the nation of Israel during a period of time where they're trying to become a nation unto themselves. All the while, he's made promises along the way, and he's showing himself to them. The historical context, again, is that the very fact that there are people all around them who have these stories. But again, their stories are so different from this God who's going to reveal to them as the God who rescued the people of Israel from Egypt, as the God who made promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as the God who created everything. That's the consistent theme that we're supposed to see. This is a God who is the creator, the one who is to be worshipped, the one who is to be adored, the one who is to be marveled at for the very fact that he was able and capable of doing all of this. So my only advice to us as we read this over and over, and as you kind of let it soak in, is that don't get caught up so much in parts of this part of the scriptures where it's not intended for you to get caught up in. Certain things, again, it's not about science, it's not about literal days of creation, eras of time, all this stuff. It's not about dinosaurs and atoms and particles and matter. It's not about any of those things. It's about God. It's for us to look at God and marvel at God. It's for us to understand that this God that we worship today is the same God who, blessed the nation of Israel to call them into a relationship, who called Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he's the same God who created. He is the creator and the one to be acknowledged and the one to be worshipped. And so he says it of himself, there is no one else like me. There is no one else that is like me. So that's what we're supposed to take away from it. So this has been our supplemental material. I hope some of this has been able to maybe help you shape and think some perspectives that maybe you're struggling with, or maybe even shape and think some of the perspectives that you are just so entrenched in that maybe you would open up and just consider other ways to look at it. So until then, we'll see you on Sunday as we go through the next part of Genesis, Genesis chapter 2. We'll see you then. God bless.